All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Yumi Kim. I am an assistant professor of Japanese and Korean history in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins. I am also one of the co-founders, along with my colleagues, Erin Chung in political science and Clara Han in anthropology, both of whom you see on the screen here. We are the co-founders of a new initiative that brings us here today called Critical Responses to Anti-Asian Violence. We come to you today from Johns Hopkins University, which is located on the traditional unceded lands of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. We recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land, including the Piscataway, Lumbee, Eastern Band of Cherokee, and many other tribes, more than 7,000 of whom currently live in Baltimore City. Within the university, we come from the Homewood campus, once known as the Carroll Farm and site of chattel slavery. Together, we acknowledge the history of violence, broken treaties, and ongoing systemic inequities as a first step towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge slavery happened on this land and anti-Blackness continues to happen here every day. We give thanks to the past, present, and future stewards of this land and respect their sovereignty and right to self-determination. Acknowledging these histories of settler colonialism and slavery and tracing how they structure our present lives is a crucial part of this new initiative, Critical Responses to Anti-Asian Violence. This initiative, as many of you may know, owes its beginnings to a tragic event, the March 16th, 2021 mass shooting in Atlanta that resulted in the death of 8 people, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent. A shooting that occurred in the context of intensifying racist and xenophobic attacks against members of the Asian American and Pacific Island communities during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. In the wake of the murders, the 3 founders of this initiative, we convened a roundtable at Hopkins that attracted over 300 people, not just at the university, but across Baltimore. And we thank those of you who attended. And we're really building on that momentum in this initiative, which we have been able to start with help of funding from the Agora Institute. And the initiative is really about building anti-racist coalitions across Johns Hopkins and Baltimore. And we do this, we build those anti-racist coalitions by looking at anti-Asian violence. Not just to say that anti-Asian violence is wrong or that we must stop it, though it goes without saying that both things are true, but in order to develop ways of understanding what anti-Asian violence is really made up of, to get at its deeper roots, to see what enables it to exist and expand. So what does enable it to exist, persist, and grow? Why is it so hard to stop? Our new initiative is bringing in speakers and guests this fall and next spring to help us answer these kinds of questions, to help us see that to tackle anti-Asian violence, we have to address things that might, at first glance, seem unrelated, like how anti-Blackness helps fuel anti-Asian violence, or how race, class, and gender intersect to uphold systems of discrimination and disadvantage. To launch our initiative, we're very honored and happy to have with us Dr. Kandice Chuh. And in a moment, my colleague, Erin Chung, will introduce her. But I'll end my welcome and introductory remarks by saying that we very much hope that this will be a space, that this initiative will help create a space at Hopkins for the very first time to center issues related to the AAPI, the Asian American Pacific Islander community. It was only in the past few days that the organizers, we realized just how historic an event even a gathering like this is. So we very much hope that you will join this space, knowing that it is a space that is welcoming, that you can ask any kinds of questions that you would like to ask. And especially the students in the audience, young people in the audience, I hope that you know that this space is yours. Even though it's a bunch of faculty on the screen, we have created this space because you have motivated us and because you are so engaged right now in trying to do things like build a major focused on racial justice and Asian Americans and the Pacific Islander community. Okay, so with that, without further ado, Erin will introduce our esteemed speaker.
Thank you, Yumi. And I also want to thank the co-sponsors of today's talk, the SNF Agora Institute, the Alexander Grouse Humanities Institute, the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship, the East Asian Studies Program, and the Department of English. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us today as well. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker of the series. Kandice Chuh is a professor of English, American Studies, and Critical Social Psychology at the CUNY Graduate Center, where she's also a member of the MA in Liberal Studies faculty, affiliate faculty to the Africana Studies program, and executive officer of the PhD program in English. She's the author of The Difference Aesthetics Makes on the Humanities After Man, published in 2019, Imagine Otherwise on Asian Americanist Critique, published in 2003, and co-editor with Karen Shimakawa of Orientations, Mapping Studies in the Asian Diaspora, published in 2001. Professor Chuh previously served as president of the American Studies Association from 2017 to 2018, and is a member of the Association for Asian American Studies, as well as the Modern Language Association. She's currently working on a collection of essays titled The Disinterested Teacher, and her current research, tentatively titled Studying Asia, focuses on Asian racialization in the era of globalization. At CUNY, she teaches courses on aesthetic theory, queer of color critique, women of color feminisms, decolonial studies, and Asian American racialization. Her talk today is titled On the Politics and Promise of Hate in Anti-Racist Work. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Kandice Chuh.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for being here today as well. I'm going to share my screen and hope that this all works. Okay. Sorry. Oops. Okay. Let me begin by making note of how deeply honored I am to be here with you today for an initiative such as CRAAV, but also because it's so hard these days to create space to really take some time with the ideas and to take some time with what it means to be pursuing anti-racist work in the academy. I'm really grateful for all of the work. I want to offer my sincere thanks specifically to Erin Chung, Clara Han, and Yumi Kim for extending the invitation, and to Nandini Day and Hannah Lee Sher for the thoughtful efforts in organizing and executing this event. My thanks as well to the co-sponsors and to all of you who are joining us. I want also to acknowledge that my remarks come of long and ongoing conversations with Karen Shimakawa, Laura Kang, and Thuy Tu regarding the issues with which we're concerned today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to think through the proliferation of discourse around anti-Asian violence as a response to that violence and the implications for intellectual work of that response, and very much appreciate the labor that goes into creating and sustaining initiatives like CRAAV that give us room and space to think together. I'd like to ask as we begin to remember and keep present with us the various kinds of labor, as well as the varying conditions of possibility that allow us to gather today. I mean to invoke into this space deliberate remembrance of the people who are always with us, even in their absence, including teachers and ancestors of different kinds, students and colleagues with whom we learn and unlearn and build and reshape worlds, as well as distinctly the living histories of dispossession. I am zooming to you from the unceded lands of the Lenni Lenape, whose struggles for sovereignty are long-lived and ongoing, and how the histories of enslavement that give rise to the present. I ask us to bring forward these histories and peoples and conditions deliberately so that our senses of place and present are perhaps a little thicker and broader than we're accustomed to experiencing. Such thickness and breadth are part of what I will encourage us to remember in the development of responses to anti-Asian violence. By March 16th, 2021, when a young white man shot and killed 8 people, including 6 women of Asian descent, in a spa and massage parlor in Atlanta, Georgia, the Stop AAPI Hate Coalition had collected reports of some 3,800 incidents of anti-Asian violence, ranging from verbal to physical assault and vandalism. On May 20th, 2021, a mere 2 months after the Atlanta murders, the US Congress enacted Public Law 11713, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, sponsored by Democratic Senator Mazie K. Hironi of Hawaii, which explicitly refers to the dramatic increase in hate crimes and violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as motivating grounds. The act cites the Atlanta case and names those killed, situating the murders, quote, in the midst of an alarming surge in anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents, and declares that the people of the United States will always remember the victims of these shootings and stand in solidarity with those affected by this senseless tragedy and incidents of hate that affected the Asian and Pacific Islander communities. The COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, in this way, codifies the ubiquitous accounts of anti-Asian violence circulating since the pandemic took hold in early 2020. Journalistic and social media platforms circulating since platforms have offered abundant and repetitive representations of assaults that, seemingly without other motivation, appear to be incited by racial hatred. The launch of the coalitional project Stop AAPI Hate on March 19, 2020, quote, in response to the alarming escalation of xenophobia and bigotry resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, by the groups, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, and Chinese for Affirmative Action, and the Asian American Studies Department at San Francisco State University, as well as the numerous rousing Stop Asian Hate rallies across the nation and beyond, are further indication of the pervasiveness of anti-Asian violence as both phenomenon and discourse. The COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act may be understood to be Congress's response to the mandate to do something in face of such renderings of violence. I take the occasion of this talk to consider the grounds and implications of this response, this doing of something, with a particular eye toward the efforts of the CRAAV initiative to, quote, develop intersectional frameworks to engage heterogeneous challenges facing AAPI communities and interrogate the effects of white supremacy on academic knowledge produced about minoritized communities. As the title of this talk suggests, I'm inviting us to think about the work hate does as a way of conceptualizing racial politics and how we study and respond to racism. In part, my interest in hate results from the curious and somewhat unsettling experience of having received declarations of love from non-Asian friends and colleagues on the heels of the Atlanta murders. My absolute unquestionable lovability aside, and however much I appreciate gestures of kindness, the experience set my ears twitching. This personal experience is, of course, to be understood as a phenomenon resulting from the general and broad-reaching diagnosis of the present as featuring, in the United States at least, a culture of hate epitomized by Trump's unabashed hate-mongering through both casual comment and policy directive. It is also a sign of the produced ignorance around racist violence. Who is or gets to be surprised by it? And a manifestation of the illusions afforded by and essentialisms of racial identity, such that the murders of people in Atlanta could trigger an association with any and perhaps all women racialized Asian. That Stop Asian Hate has become the call sign for declaring solidarity with those vulnerable to violence, registers the affect-driven nature of contemporary public discourse, and I believe calls on us to pause in the way I'm asking us to do today. My remarks here also reflect my general and ongoing interest in contemporary Asian racialization and how we study and know Asia and Asianness. For some time now, I have been interested in asking, in this so-called Asian century, How does Asian function as a specifically or distinctively racial category? And what can that function tell us about contemporary racialization? These general questions take more specific shape in the face of the discourse on hate. What does the ascription of hatred tell us about the racial function of Asia? What does it mean to be the juridical, exemplary subject of hatred? In all of this, I'm guided by the sharp wisdom of Laura Kang's Traffic in Asian Women, in which she studies the transnational production of Asian women as, quote, distinguished figures of female injury and women's empowerment in the 1990s. Tracing throughout the course of the 20th century, the production of the Asian woman as such, as a facet of academic study, feminist activism, and global governance, Kang compels us to ask after the conditions out of which the figure emerges, and the kinds and function of the extensive visibility the figure bears. How and why did Asian women become intelligible through particular modes of documenting their violation and violability? Put differently, how and why did Asian women function as an especially demonstrative and portable embodiment of both the taxonomic singularities and the compounded intensity of female oppression? But also, how did the privileging of spectacularly and especially sexually violated Asian female bodies foreclose other terms and conditions for making Asian women intelligible? Kang's questions, of course, resonate strongly with the mediation of the Atlanta murders and the immediate sexualization of the women killed there, as well as the central role that women of Asian descent play in the Hate Crimes Act. The specific visibility of the women of Asian descent killed, in contrast to the other two people who were murdered in Atlanta, clearly evinces the link Kang draws between intelligibility and the documentation of violence. In similar vein, we may ask after the construction and visibility of the Asian as made known and knowable through documented hatred. That is, what are we to make of the intelligibility of the Asian through a mode of documentation that leads with hate? And what terms and conditions by which Asianness might be rendered or foreclosed in the process? I try in what follows to share my as yet still preliminary engagement with such questions. There are two main ideas I'll offer for our collective consideration. One, I've come to believe that the enactment of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, because of what it enables and occludes, and contrary to its popular billing, is something of a renewed moment of danger for anti-racist work focalized around anti-Asian violence. Under the cover provided by the US state by its stance against hate for Asians, the act operates within recognizably model minority logics and occludes the long reign of state violence responsible for the production of Asianness, but also Blackness as subjugated racial categories, and elides important distinctions between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, thus occluding the violence of US empire and settler colonialism. Drawing on critiques of hate crimes laws and attentive to the seductions of incorporation into and embraced by the US nation, I observed the opportunistic way the US state has leveraged and deployed the spectacularization of anti-Asian violence toward the ends of building out policing infrastructures. This hate crime law, and perhaps hate crimes legislation generally, are, I suggest, best understood as forms of, quote, official anti-racism, to borrow Jody Malamit's rendering of US governmental and other institutional practices and policies that promote diversity and multiculturalism instead of enacting genuine address of racism's differential distribution of life. Two, the congealment of Asian American identity into a figure of victimhood and hatred effected by the Hate Crimes Act, but also by the popular Stop Asian Hate campaigns, is thrown immediately and sharply into relief by looking up and out of a US frame. A critical spatial imagination, like those afforded by transpacific approaches, presses on the inadequacy of nation-based frameworks in the analysis of racialization as it generatively returns complexity to the ideas of Asia and Asianness. When white supremacy can no longer be assumed the foundational cause and horizon of racism, the materializing force and effects of imperialism, colonialism, nationalism, and capitalism in their enmeshment comes to the fore. Moreover, a transpacific approach allows us to recognize the continuing potency of the intimate link between the modern nation state and racism. We are in this light prompted to redirect the insistence on stopping anti-Asian hate as a remedy for racism to challenging anew the racializing violence that has never not been part of the modern nationalist project. What follows is organized into two chunks correlating with these main ideas, and I'll close with a brief comment on what all this might mean for the kind of work we undertake by attending to the specificities of Asian racialization. So the entire talk runs about 38 minutes. 1, legislating hate. Unsurprisingly, the current popularity and normalcy of hate as a facet of US political culture has been attributed by mainstream media and academic study to the Trump presidency. As captured by the Clinton campaign slogan, "Love Trump's hate," his politics are easily classified as hateful. The derivation and mobilization of hate as a political category correlates with a polemic-driven, persistently abrasive, and highly personalized style of politics Trump exemplifies, though he is by no means its sole practitioner. Typically, as pansy Kathleen Duncan notes, in US mainstream media, hate is cast as a signal attribute of extremist right-wing groups. In such attributions, hate is posited and presumed to be both unacceptable and irredeemable. A legacy of, quote, liberal political theory's long-standing tendency to laminate its social and civil ideals to affective ideals like love, sympathy, and compassion, Duncan explains. It is no surprise that liberalism's struggle to yoke itself to love should have as its eerie double a struggle to locate hate among its ideological and political enemies. Duncan is reminding us that at the core of liberal political philosophy sits the ideal of moral virtue, one derived in part through the exclusion of hate. Morally virtuous people are not hateful according to liberalism, and conversely, hateful people cannot be recognized or embraced as upstanding citizens. Trump serves as something of an ideal test case in this calculus. The problem, of course, in focusing on Trump and his starkly racist remarks and policies as the originator of hate is the potential occlusion and disavowal of the longer and deeper histories and conditions out of which Trump himself, as well as his style of politics, emerge. As Duncan puts it, in identifying hate as the source of a particular position, gesture, or speech act, we effectively drain said position, gesture, or speech act of political agency or representational power, reducing it from an at least potentially polemical action in or response to the world to the histrionic expression of reprehensible personhood. The explanatory power of the ascription of reprehensible personhood obscures the work of seeking and producing a fuller account of the economic, social, political, and affective forces that energize and give rise to hate. It is in this vein that we might consider in coupled form Trump's racialization of COVID-19 and the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. Reprehensible though he may be, we know that Trump did not inaugurate anti-Asian, or more particularly anti-Chinese racism. Famously codified in the 1875 Page Law and the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, a steady and foundational racism against people from China formatively shapes US history and is encapsulated in the liberal Justice John Marshall Harlan's dissent in the era-defining 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision as the, quote, race so different from our own. Writing in 2000, Terry Yulin Chin summarizes, violence has been an integral part of the histories and experiences of Asian Americans in the United States from our arrival in this nation to the present. Anti-Asian violence can occur at any given moment. I will forgo a lengthy recitation of the manifold incidents of such violence at the hands of both state authorities and ordinary people, and note simply, there is no dearth of historic and current evidence proving as much as abundantly demonstrated by Asian Americanist scholarship. I want to bookmark this matter of evidence to return to later. For now, I want to ask, given this history, why now is Congress moved to enact legislation against anti-Asian violence? What makes such violence actionable in the present? The answer may partly lie in the ways that the Hate Crimes Act enables the US nation to obscure the nation's own anti-Asian racism. As does the criminalization of hate crimes generally, this act individualizes racism, making it the purview of bad actors in need of punishment rather than a systemic and structural problem. Criminalization and incarceration as the processes by which social problems are addressed always operate in this individualizing way, of course. The US government has taken concerted interest in hate crimes, defined generally as criminal acts motivated by prejudice against a protected group, since the 1980s. By the end of the 1990s, the majority of states had enacted substantive hate crime laws or sentence enhancement guidelines in relation to incidents involving what James Jacobs and Kimberly Potter tellingly describe as, quote, officially disfavored prejudices. They explain, generically, hate crime is meant to distinguish criminal conduct motivated by prejudices from criminal conduct motivated by lust, jealousy, greed, politics, and so forth. Hate crime legislation emphasizes the offender's attitudes, values, and character. This marks a separation from classical jurisprudence on criminal behavior, which focuses more on the crime than the offender. Hate crime laws condemn discrimination as they posit a causal relationship between prejudice and behavior. There is, I should note, variety among hate crimes laws of different polities. Gender, sexuality, and disability, for example, are unevenly identified as motivating grounds or protected classes for hate crime legislation. I am, for today's purposes, referring mostly to federal hate crimes laws. Within the symbolic economy, hate crimes legislation function as a finding of acceptability and a sign of perhaps loving embrace by the nation. Part of the reason for this embrace of Asian Americans, as noted in the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, is the fact that, quote, more than 2 million Asian American businesses have contributed to the diverse fabric of American life. Productive members of multicultural America, Asian Americans deserve protection by the state. The act demonstrates a return to the real America figured by Trump's kindly grandfatherly successor. It buttresses the narrative that holds Trump to be anomalous, a narrative that situates America itself as having needed the salvation that comes to us in the person of Biden. Hate crimes are jurisprudentially held to be worse than other kinds of crimes, and the motivation of an officially disfavored prejudice worse than others, in part because their effects are understood to be more widely felt. Indeed, studies reporting heightened anxiety among Asian Americans because of contemporary anti-Asian violence attest to such an effect. Even the most radical critiques of hate crimes laws make note of the importance of their symbolic value in this regard. That is, as affirmation of minoritized experience important to mental health, and relatedly, as a means of heightening the public's awareness and mitigating the pernicious, wide-ranging impact of racist and other identity-related forms of violence. As Dean Spade and Craig Wills have put it, hate crimes legislation can increase public consciousness about and provide specific legal protection to subordinated groups often positioned only on the bad side of the law, that is, as targets of criminal penalty or police brutality. In their consideration of hate crimes laws designed to protect transgender subjects, they note the important role such laws have played in moving public discourse away from categorizing transgender people as mentally ill, and towards recognizing that gender deviant people require protection from prejudice in order to participate safely in society. Such symbolic value translates to better material conditions, they advise, and must be acknowledged seriously. Critiques of hate crimes legislation are plentiful and run the gamut from philosophical objections to the legislation of thought or feeling to pragmatic criticisms of their ineffectiveness in deterring violence. Neither criminalization nor sentence enhancement appear to have significant effect in this regard. Among the most trenchant of these critiques are those that recognize the insidious effects of criminalization in the course of acknowledging the ineffectual nature of hate crimes laws. Because communities of color are so over-policed, experience police brutality, and are under-resourced by the state, the resultant distrust of state authority means that activity that might be construed as a hate crime regularly goes unreported. Indeed, it is generally accepted that such activity is dramatically underreported. It is an explicit address of the positive need for data that the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act is oriented. As with previous efforts, notably the 1990 Hate Crime Statistics Act, the scope of which was expanded by the 1994 Crime Bill, data collection is cast as vital to the effort to respond to violence against minoritized groups. The COVID-19 Act is designed to facilitate the expedited review of COVID-19 hate crimes. It designates responsibility to an employee of the Department of Justice for issuing guidance to state, local, and tribal authorities regarding the establishment of online hate crime reporting platforms, the collection of data disaggregated by protected characteristic, and the expansion of educational campaigns regarding COVID-19 hate crimes. These campaigns are to include effort by the Department of Justice and the Department of Health and Human Services to raise awareness of hate crimes, and the bill provides for grants from local law enforcement authorities to implement their own reporting hotlines. Even before the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act was passed, we began to see the effects at the local level of data-driven responses to anti-Asian violence by state authorities. Rachel Kuo and Matthew Bui report, for example, of the creation in August 2020 of the Asian Hate Crime Task Force by the NYPD, which is comprised by primarily Asian American officers. Concerns about underreporting translate in this context to the use of information gathered outside of law enforcement, such as emergency medical response data and commercial camera footage. To be sure, they explain, as they unfold their sustained argument cautioning against the uses of data collection for policing purposes, data-driven processes have been linked to how different groups can advocate for public resources and benefits, where the collection and analysis of data about racially marginalized community can legitimate political claims. However, and at the same time, we know that data has been instrumental in classification and control. Kuo and Bui importantly remind us that data collection by law enforcement to police and surveil communities of color is not new. These practices are rooted in the long legacy of anti-Black racism in the United States and embedded into contemporary data-driven technologies. Moreover, state investment in data infrastructures, such as national quotas and registration systems to police, incarcerate, and deport Asian and Asian Americans as terror threats, criminals, and illegal, has been longstanding. Essentially, they explain, we are witnessing a repurposing of war on terror infrastructures created in the wake of 9/11, where the surveillance and policing of Muslims and Arab Americans have been a key component of US counterterrorism efforts. I want to return for a moment to the point I bookmarked earlier regarding the matter of evidence attesting to anti-Asian violence. Alongside these critiques of data-driven policing, I cannot but wonder also at the need for quantification. How many lives must be damaged before violence is considered sufficiently significant for state intervention? Is there really any doubt that Asian race people are being harassed or indeed murdered in interactions that register racism's deadly potency? Certainly in the aftermath of 9/11, violence against Arab Americans has erupted, and racist attacks on Black and Brown people are all too readily, abundantly documented. This current need for data collection on the part of the state strikes me as an enactment of a willful, produced, and potent ignorance that allows the US nation to avoid responsibility for structural racism. Study upon study exists, entire fields of knowledge comprised by meticulous and rigorous studies documenting the emergence of Asian, Brown, and Black as racial categories in the US context by dint of various kinds of racist violence. One of our present tasks must surely be to attend carefully to the role of data and the ways and means of ignorance advantageous to the state in our present articulations of anti-racist work. I take note of the fact that while the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act includes in its findings the particular vulnerability of older Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who are recent immigrants or have limited English proficiency to discrimination, economic insecurity, and language isolation, the Act does not primarily direct resources toward the remediation of these conditions, folding what support it does provide into its directives to the DHHS. That is, this is very much an extension of policing apparatus and not an effort designed actually to support Asian American communities. Section 2, minoritarian, not minority. I've been suggesting that efforts to combat anti-Asian racism, couched in terms of hate, arguably do more harm than good. They individualize and personalize racism, legitimate policing, surveillance, and carcerality as the appropriate response to social problems, and they operate on the bifurcated logics found in model minority discourse, according to which good subjects are embraced at the expense of the subjugation of others. Kuo and Bui helpfully summarize other inclusions affected by the rhetorical translation of racism into hatred by making note of the absence of the different scales and degrees of violence in media discussions of anti-Asian violence, including those of labor and economic exploitation, inadequate social safety nets, and immigration detention and deportation. As they put it, the circulation of exceptional violence obfuscates the slow and quiet forms of state violence. This is, of course, thematically the stuff of Asian American studies, which has, albeit unevenly, long stressed the formative role of capital and empire in Asian American subject formation. The question is how to puncture the occlusions to allow for more complex histories and understandings, greater publicity. It is striking how immediately and effectively the construction of the Asian as penultimate figure of hatred gives way to a much more complex scene, simply by taking up what we might provisionally consider a transpacific frame or approach. The project of stopping anti-Asian hate is brought up short in the face of the multiplicity and heterogeneity that is Asianness. The fictionality of the construct Asian comes strongly to the fore, along with the impossibility of containing its meaning to minority status. We are reminded of the important distinction between minoritarian, which, following Eve Sedgwick, refers to a way of being and relating and knowing the world, relating to and knowing the world that does not aspire to assimilation or majoritarian life, and minority, a term bearing the weight of long histories of racial subjugation. Hate crimes legislation reify minorities as such. Our task, I submit, is to energize and amplify minoritarian being. To do so means in part disidentification with the forms of incorporation offered by the nation state. Transpacific frameworks facilitate such disidentification by making us acutely aware of the intimacy of racism and nationalism and the living histories of colonialism and empire out of which the present emerges. Delinked from white supremacy as presumed ground or horizon, racism's core operation in hierarchically differentiating and distributing resources and vulnerability among groups may be clearly seen. It is what makes racism an integral and vital partner of modern nationalism, given its exclusionary nature. Racially motivated policies are evident across the vast scope of Asia, as present in post-communist nations as in post-colonial ones, to wit, the sorting into racial identities in the process of emerging out of formal colonialism in such places as Malaysia and Singapore has made the deep and robust heterogeneity characterizing them more governable. While in South Korea, the experiences of harassment and discrimination of international students from China bespeaks a comparative racial ideology at work. In China, in turn, students from a variety of African countries, especially those from sub-Saharan Africa, face immense and intense COVID-related discrimination. While in India and Indonesia, right-wing populism plays out the racist logics, South Korean political culture and cultural politics features multiculturalism, reportedly in part introduced by the government to regulate the increasing numbers of racial others that is a facet of its place in global capitalism today. In these arenas, official multiculturalism is not understood to be a remedy for racism, as it is in the United States, so much as a pathway to incorporation into the national body politic. These are, of course, but a mere handful of examples of the prevalence of racial thinking and cognate logics across the massive geography to which Asia refers. Even so, we can, I think, begin to apprehend the prevalence of what Christopher Patterson has adeptly described as pluralist forms of governance operating across the Trans-Pacific. At once de-exceptionalizing the United States and affording recognition of multiculturalism, pluralism, and multiracialism as strategies of governance tied to national identity formation in a variety of Asian countries. Critical acknowledgement of the continuing stronghold of modern nationalism prompts us to hold nationalism center stage in theorizing and enacting anti-racist work. Asian and Asian American as identities might accordingly be seen less as, in Patterson's words, ascribed characteristics to be praised or empowered, or hated or loved for that matter, to understanding them as imperial and nationalist strategies of appropriation, social stratification, and incorporation. We might in this regard resound the urgency Lisa Yoneyama voices in her theorization of the necessity and specific affordances of transpacific analysis in the present. She explains, quote, "The transpacific analytic is particularly urgent in the new century because it compels us to confront the structuring legacies of the transitional moment from World War II to the onset of the Cold War." Yoneyama is referring to the mid-century entanglements of American and Japanese empires that buttress the US's self-declared narrativization of its liberatory conduct during World War II. This narrative, she explains, assumes that prior to the war, Japan was a nation lagging in modernity and that it had failed to cultivate its latent potential to embrace liberal ideals until it was vanquished militarily and then reborn under American tutelage. It is in this context that we find a foundational iteration of the liberation of non-white women from non-white men in the circulating narratives of the salvation of Japanese women by General Douglas MacArthur's directives to grant them rights. This point returns us to Kang's enjoinder to ask of the figure of the Asian woman what work that figure does and toward what ends, always with an eye toward assessing the strategic craftiness of empire. Patterson's and Yoneyama's emphases on empire converge with critical acknowledgement of the elision of the Pacific Islander in the discourse of anti-Asian hate. While named in the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act and folded, if uncomfortably and with contestation, into the construct Asian Pacific Islander American, the act registers no sense of the decisive differences between the experiences and constitution of Asian American as a racial formation and Pacific Islander as a native and colonized entity. Although racial thinking is part of colonial epistemology, the translation of sovereign peoples into minority groups, even or perhaps especially for the purposes of offering protection by the state, is distinctively a colonizing move. Such work as Kandice Chuh's on Asian settler colonialism and Vincent Diaz on Guam, together with Denise Cruz and Vincent Raphael's analyses of Filipino histories and cultures, and Kehaulani Kaunui and Noelani Goodyear Kapo'oa's elucidations of Native Hawaiian sovereignties and struggles, for example, insist on critical recognition of the multiple and variegated colonialisms traversing the Pacific. Transpacific analysis, in other words, and to borrow a constellation suggested by Quan-Xing Chen, recalls the necessity of thinking decolonization, de-imperialism, and denationalization all at once. As a framework and approach that emphasizes entanglements across the Pacific as object and objective of knowledge, the Trans-Pacific has proven generative and capacious in keeping the critical eye focused on the ever-changing trajectories and configurations of power that shape and reshape the worlds we inhabit. What makes such an approach appropriate to minoritarian horizons is precisely its attention to and persistent critique of power. And finally, by way of conclusion, of the project of reorienting Asian American studies through Asia, Ximing Wang has explained, Asia in this context is not understood as a cultural, racial, or geographic marker, but rather functions as a critical locus of intellectual practice and commitment, haunted by interconnected histories and memories of war, displacement, and movement between nations and across the ocean. A geohistorical nexus and interactive plurality, Asia refuses to settle into a knowable object, a source of identity. By way of closing, I invite us to consider, what would it take for Asian American to have similar function and effect? To be a rubric and a problem space for, as Minju Bae and Mark Tsang Putterman put it, thinking together the discourses of anti-Blackness and Orientalism, not as equivalent, but constitutive components of global racial capitalism. To be the critical locus wherein the intimate link between indigenous dispossession, native sovereignty struggles, and racism can be held together without requiring or demanding equivalence. To refer to solidarities across space and organized around a common project of de-imperialization and decolonization. To be a term that refers to strategies of world making and not one that exemplifies subjugation, hatred, or indeed model minoritarian status. What pedagogies and practices, curricula and institutional arrangements can and do precipitate and enact these possibilities? There is, of course, already a rich array of scholarship that does all this and more. I understand our gathering today to be an occasion to think collectively through the question, how can we amplify and proliferate that work? The point here is not to try to perfect the terms Asian or Asian American, but instead to make them stubbornly resistant to cooptation by empire and nation, the systems of which have proven to be on the biggest scale and the most intransigent of purveyors of anti-Asian violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Chu, for this rich and generative talk. We're now going to open up the webinar to questions and answers. So please submit your questions through the Q&A function in your Zoom menu. And it looks like we already have quite a few, and I'll start with the first one. So this is an anonymous question. Do you think there's something specific to the nature of the hate directed at Asians in the United States, as opposed to, say, the hate directed at Black people, Latinx, or Indigenous groups? Mm-hmm. And does hate feel different depending on the targeted group?
Thank you for the question. So, I don't think I can answer that in terms of does hate feel different for different groups, but I do think that we could think about how hate is mobilized differently, how it is recruited differently and deployed differently across various racial formations and across various groups. So I'm thinking, for example, you know, in thinking about something like the hate crimes law, you know, as I found my way into it and into the discourse of hate and the kind of the literature on that's criticizing hate crimes legislation, one of the things that struck me is that there's something that, and I think that this is specific to Asian American racial formation, but not exclusive to it. I think that there is a form of hate that is actually an expression of racist love, right? So there's something to me about this hate crimes legislation and the states affixing so readily, you know, seeing Asian American subjects as the subjects of hate, definitionally as the subjects of hate, and now juridically that way, right? We're defined that way in law. But it is under the guise of offering protection that feels very much like, you know, and I was thinking about Vince Raphael's work about white love in the Philippines. That feels very much like the kind of paternalistic white love, which is a form of hate, right? It can only be based on some sense of, you know, diminishment, right? And that, you know, maybe it's not particular to Asian Americanness per se, but I think it is particular to the colonial endeavor. And certainly, you know, the history of the US and the 20th century, the face of the Asian has figured repeatedly over and over and over again as the figure of the enemy. And so I think that there is a way that that enemy status is simultaneously kind of doubled, you know, that there is a doubled love and hate that is always present, you know, in a kind of uncanny way. Psychoanalytic discourse is not really my idiom, so, you know, I can't really go in that direction that far. I will say, you know, I think I want to think about this in relation to hate crimes against other groups, and I guess it plays out differently, right? So So for example, the 1968 Civil Rights Act, it is in a sense a hate crimes act, right? It makes illegal discrimination based on race, right? Discrimination based on anti-Blackness. But it is not, it does not in any way feel sincere. I don't know. It feels like it was it feels like it became a way to introduce a new form of governmentality that was about surveillance, the introduction of surveillance. And on that point, I would point us to Erica Edwards' new book, The Other Side of Terror, which traces a long history of counterinsurgency, the policing of counterinsurgency as the prehistory to the sort of infrastructures that we get in the aftermath of 9/11. So. No, I'm not really answering the question directly. I mean, I think I would need to actually really think about hate and how it's ascribed to other racial formations in order to address that more fully. But, I don't know that I have seen hate mobilized in this particular way, in this robust way, culturally and politically and legally, around other groups, as I have around Asian Americanness. So.
There is another question that has a bit of overlap with your discussion about colonialism. So what does the evolution of portrayals of Asian Americans reveal about the subjectivity of racialization as a tool of colonialism and racial capitalism?
Can you say that again?
Sure. What does the evolution of portrayals of Asian Americans reveal about the subjectivity of racialization as a tool of colonialism and racial capitalism?
So I'm going to, I take that question to be, evolution of representations moving from kind of, I don't know, the overtly Orientalist depictions through to present day forms of neo-Orientalist depictions, perhaps, right? And I don't, it's hard for me to think about that as an evolution so much as a genealogy, I guess. So let me rewrite that and say that I think that there is a genealogy whereby we can understand the shifting modalities of the representation of Asianness vis-a-vis Asian American subjectivity that allows us to recognize how the course of US empire, the ways in which it has operated across the Pacific and interacted with British colonialism, with Japanese empire, through the course of the different labor migrations and the particular ways that racial capitalism has unfolded as a global, as a process and project that has produced the globe as such, right? We can certainly see that the representations currently, mark the conditions of their production. So in other words, I guess, we can think about popular representations like the Crazy Rich Asians, right? That are, it's hard to imagine that, right, in an earlier moment. It's hard to imagine how those representations could possibly have operated, or that they could have found expression and popularization in the ways that they have in an earlier moment, because the place and the role of global racial capitalism was different in these earlier moments. So I do think that there is something about taking cultural representation as a point of entry into the study of the political economic grounds and social formations and conditions of possibility that give rise to them. But I would say that it's actually, I think it's really important that we don't think in terms of evolution or development and think in terms of genealogy. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
So here's a very different question. So what do you think of Asian American movements that strive for assimilation into majoritarian political systems?
Yeah. Okay, so I don't particularly want to throw shade on individual people. So my interest is never in judging what people do. I want to know why they do it, and I want to know how they are induced, right? And they, including me, what is it that makes the majoritarian sphere, makes assimilation, makes incorporation so appealing and available? And I think it's only appealing and available to a very small segment or a small sector of the population, the massive population we're referring to in the designation, under the designation Asian. So I think I want to say that majoritarian life, that the status quo, that the ways in which we are induced hegemonically to believe in a very, very particular version of what happiness is or what the good life is so incredibly narrow and so incredibly impoverished and so incredibly impoverishing, right? It only can exist by decimating the planet, really. I mean, we've seen this. This isn't, it isn't anything that needs to be proved again. We're actually living inside of that. So I would want to know or ask of majoritarian movements, what is the continuing appeal there, right? What makes it possible for our senses and our sensibilities to be oriented in a way that doesn't care, that isn't moved by those realities, but nonetheless still hews to, a promise that is really tiny and thin. And I don't know, there's so much more, there's just so much more that we can, and that people already do, right? People already live so much more robust and full lives. I guess that's would be my response, So, I've written a little separately in a different context about, the subject who embraces the model minority myth, right? Who actually isn't critical of it, but who actually wants to embody it. And there's a lot of infrastructure that points us in that direction, right? We are everything from the ways in which late 20th century immigration laws selected out certain kinds of class subjects, right? Immigrants from particular class backgrounds, from particular educational backgrounds, to the histories of anti-Blackness and the histories of anti-Brownness, as well as settler colonialism and dispossession. Inside of that playing field, we're oriented to say, no, actually, you're the welcome ones, right? I mean, there is something about the seductions of incorporation that I think are really, they're incredibly powerful, not because any single person is weak, but because all of our forces, right, our educational systems, our apparatus, our structures teach us to value those things. What I find hope in actually is that it fails to inculcate people so regularly and so readily, right? I mean, there's a lot of radical revolutionary energy, a lot of queer energy, that erupts everywhere and always. And that to me is a sure sign that the majoritarian way, it just can't hold. People are so much more interesting. Being is so much more interesting than what that is. So, anyway.
So I have a couple more questions related to Asian American movements, and there are two questions I think go very nicely together, so I'll read both of them. So the first is, how does the class character of current Asian American movements related to COVID-19 differ from that of radical activism in the 1960s, and how has this impacted the goals of the movement? And a second question from Susie Schlossberg: knowing the rich history of AAPI student activism and coalition building with other marginalized identities, as well as taking note of the fact that Hopkins has an undergraduate Asian population of over 25%, what role can we play in shaping a campus culture that is proactive in combating anti-Asian hate culture?
Mm-hmm. So I guess let me I'm really sorry that we actually can't do this as a conversation, because this would just be just a good conversation to have. Okay, so a couple of different things. So the history of student activism, I understand also to be an intellectual genealogy. And this, you know, I learn a great deal from Roderick Ferguson's work on student movements in this regard. So it seems to me that one of our jobs as people who work inside of educational institutions is to create space for the intellectual work that is happening under the guise or in the practice of activism, and understand how that intersects with, interacts with, transforms, changes, but also contradicts perhaps other forms of knowledge that we are producing. I think that it's actually really vital. So I don't know that much about Hopkins, but I think it's actually vital that thinking about Asian Trans-Pacific studies, Asian studies, Asian American studies is de-linked from the demographics of the university. So, and I say that because there is something, I don't know, the demographic argument, right, is really, it really reiterates a kind of racial essentialism, as if only people who inhabit certain bodies should know the history of labor, of labor exploitation, of settler colonialism, of, you know, I don't know, all of the things, that internment, right? That somehow it's only relevant or you know, kind of interesting to people who inhabit certain bodies. And, you know, I used to use this, I mean, this is really tongue in cheek, and it's probably a shorthand I should stop using, but I used to say in English departments or in English context every once in a while, it's like, well, you know, show me all of the 18th century British people running around that legitimates the reason that we have 18th century studies, and then I will make the argument for Asian American studies in that same vein, right? So there's something about actually insisting and creating space for our projects as intellectual projects that's really crucial, right? Because I want to say that actually it is about, not so much about the reproduction of a particular kind of identity-based knowledge, but in fact, in order to drive forward knowledge practices, to change the curriculation of power and knowledge so that we can actually address racism, so that we can actually address the systems of global racial capitalism, colonialism, you know, all of those kinds of things that together, you know, operate to produce a present where violence is normal, right? Where violence is really, really regular. So I think that student activism actually, like, that's, you know, it's a vital source of intellectual activity, and it's a vital source of you know, kind of transformation, right? Transformation of the institution. But I also want to say it should never, I think that we want to be careful about trying to make the institution better, so much as our project, I think, is to use the resources that the institution has to leverage the projects that are much bigger than any given space, that are much bigger than any given place. So that, you know, that's the way that I would respond to that in this one. Yeah.
Right. This is another anonymous question. It says, 2 years ago, I attended a BLM event, and the two main speakers spoke of needing more Black banks to support Black businesses, and then asked why Asians control so many of them. I was shocked, yet the Black crowd clapped. How do we mitigate these anti-Asian sentiments between people of color groups?
So we know that being a person of color is not an immunity to racism of any kind, to holding bias, to holding prejudice, because those things are structurally and systemically induced, right? So we don't opt in or out of those systems. We can make ourselves as aware as possible about how we are being trained and educated and directed and disciplined to value certain people and not others, to be drawn to certain ideas and not others, and so on. I think that the more that we have those conversations in all of the sites that we can, the more we can take a comment like, why do Asians control so many banks? Not personally, but actually as an artifact that requires us to ask, what allows us to frame this idea in this way, right? So what is actually being said in that kind of a statement is, an expression of desire for more control over the economic future of Blackness, right? Of Black Americans. So why it's getting framed in relation to Asianness, right? Or Asian people holding banks, is actually something that takes us out into precisely that transpacific realm, that actually invites us to ask those questions of what is it that's making this available? What kind of discourse on the Asian century, on the belief that Asian people have a lot of money, categorically Asian people have a lot of money, all of those kinds of things, like that is the work of our study. So how it actually plays out in terms of among people of color, right? So this is one of the things that I think is so vital, is actually we have to keep coming back to the table, right? Not to try to correct each other, but actually to start opening those conversations and to saying, when you frame it that way, what can't you see, right? When you frame this question about Black economic power and Black economic futurity in relation to Asianness, what we miss out on is the broader history of global capitalism. What we miss out on is the broader history of finance, right? And how money flows. There's nothing that's immediate there's no immediate fix. And I actually think there shouldn't be, right? There is, in fact, a lot of kind of built-in antagonisms, and the antagonisms are not built in because of racial differences, right? It's because they're produced and induced in this way. And we always have to remember who and what benefits from those kinds of divisions. And it's never us, it's never the POC, right? It's somebody else is happening in some other system. So that's what I would say. Whenever we have those moments, I think that it is a moment for, it's not a teaching moment, it's actually a moment for learning, right? It's actually a moment to sit with it and to kind of just ask that question, what allows that formulation to operate in that way, in that context?
Thank you. So this is a different question from Allison Lee. Given that hate crime laws seem to be not only ineffective at deterring hate crimes, but also sometimes actively harmful, that is used as a tool to build policing infrastructure, perpetuating distinctions between minorities and the majority, is it possible for the state to make good hate crime legislation? And what might the government's role look like in fighting against hate crimes?
I think that embedded into that question is kind of an impasse, a critical impasse, right? Which is, so long as we think about racism as hate crime, I think we actually can't address it in the way that I think it needs to get addressed. So I don't know that it's possible to legislate hate. I mean, as an emotion or as a motivating ground. And in fact, I'm actually not interested in it. I don't actually care if you hate me. I just don't want you to do violence to me, right? And that's really a kind of fine line. It's not pleasant to be hated, but it is a difference from saying, I know that this group hates me and I'm afraid to go there, versus I know this group hates me and that's just how things are, right? So, so long as there is a kind of reduction or personalization, right, of racism into these forms, I don't see how there can be legislation that can address that. So that would be one thing. What I would love to see is if an act like the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act was actually the COVID-19 Resource Distribution Act, right? Where now we see, okay, COVID-19 has actually laid bare so many of the ways that race, class, and indigeneity actually, illuminates how impoverished and how kind of precarious people's lives are, right? Given that, let's actually start to distribute resources accordingly, right? We know that the government can do this. When it decided that testing and vaccines were necessary, they mobilized and found the money, right? And I have to admit, the whole debt ceiling thing kind of wigs me out. We just keep raising the debt ceiling. So the fictionality of money is a whole different thing. But that I would say, like, that would be a good law, right? That would be a good law where we says, actually, we can in fact see how a strong state can operate for the benefit of the most vulnerable communities. And I believe that in states, like I think that should be a function of our state. That's the kind of state that I want, is one that actually produces support, safe social safety nets. I want to return us in that direction. And that, to my mind, would actually be an address of racism, right? Would in fact be an address of the consequences of racism. It's not going to solve it or get rid of racism, but it certainly is much more of a direct address than saying, let me just go find out, where is there most incidents of violence so that I can put more police there, right? And that seems to be, I'm putting it crudely, but that seems more or less the intent behind most hate crimes legislation.
I have another question that has to do with Asian American studies and the Trans-Pacific framework. So thank you, Dr. Chuh, for your thought-provoking talk. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more on the significance of the Trans-Pacific framework, perhaps inter-Asian framework, in unsettling a consolidated identity of the Asian American. How do you envision the reworking of Asian American studies in light of moving beyond or next to the nation state frame? And what new areas of research and advocacy open up when you do so? And further, would we also need to question the current configuration of area studies, such as East Asian studies?
Thank you. So there is this kind of a wonderfully rich and robust scholarship on the Trans-Pacific that is continuing to grow, and it's probably, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 years old now. And it follows a rich and robust set of scholarship that is on Pacific Rim discourse, as well as challenges to older formations, to older area studies formations, Cold War formations of area studies. So, which is to say, partly, like, this work is already being done. And I think that in certain kind of, I don't know, sites of Asian American studies, right? There's kind of a really wonderful conversation that's already happening. Yeah? Those sites tend, in my view, to be on the West Coast, and partly it is the Pacific Coast, right? So one of the wonderful things, but also the curiosities of being an Asian Americanist on the East Coast, is that it isn't the kinds of genealogies and the roots of the field are much different than on the West Coast. So there is a different kind of point of departure. For me, on the East Coast, one of the exciting things about thinking of the Trans-Pacific is that it allows me also to continue to engage the transatlantic. So it isn't something that I want to I don't want to substitute out things, but in much more of a Lisa Lowe sort of way, right? Thinking the intimacies of four continents, I think the project is actually to try to take up entanglement itself as the object of knowledge, right? So no longer, it's really not about focusing on particular identities or on deriving new objects of study, so much as actually attuning to relationality itself, right? As the means by which things that seem sedimented, right, came into being. And I think that that's really exciting. And, again, I think it has already been done, or it is underway. So having said that, there's a lot of unevenness, right? I mean, there are a lot of people, Asian American studies is now more than 50 years old. Area studies is longer than that. And it's super multifaceted. I mean, I think, Aaron and Yumi and Kara could probably speak more specifically to the area study side of things. But what makes me happy is since I left graduate school in the mid-90s. And at that time, area studies and Asian American studies, Asian studies and Asian American studies really just didn't have a conversation going. But I would say that the conversation, that's really not the case anymore. There are absolutely people in both fields who still don't have any interest in having a conversation. But I think there are a lot more of us who actually are interested. So, because I live here, because I live in the United States, because I live in this place, and my interest is actually in trying to figure out how this place came into being, right? In these particular ways, I will never not be interested in articulating through the rubric of Asian Americanist critique. But what that means for me is not that's not a point of arrival, that's actually a point of departure, right? It means that I ask questions in particular ways. It doesn't mean that I limit myself to the questions that I can ask. And the kind of work that the Transpacific has been doing as a rubric that's coming into emergence, I'm thinking also about the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Project, right? Similarly, and that's actually more of an East Coast based project, I think. Similarly, there's been much less interest or investment in trying to close down the boundaries of what it is that we study, and more think about the points of encounter, right, and entanglement. And that's just super fun. And it really gets us out of the compartmentalized ways of thinking and working that are the legacies of the Enlightenment University, the legacies of what we inhabit. So in that kind of intellectual register, I think that there's, we're already doing the things. And I do mean that we're just trying to amplify it in some ways as a way of thinking the present, right? As a way of looking out and saying, this is what I see happening. How do I explain this, right? What is the explanation that I can provide?
Mm-hmm. And this is certainly something that we're going to be exploring throughout our speaker series this fall about encounters and entanglements. I have another question that is related. So how does the relationship between the Asian American intellectual class and systems of commodified knowledge reinforce dominant American political discourses? And what is the responsibility of academia to acknowledge its complicity in reinforcing colonial narratives?
So the how is embedded, I think, in the question, right? So the Asian American intellectual class, we function as a class. I think there is a cohort. I don't know if I would think about it as a class. Maybe it is a class, actually. I mean, if we think about it as in terms of kind of the relations to the environment of work, the particular way in which we relate to work. The responsibility, so I think anybody who is working inside of a university ought to be attentive to the deep history and implicatedness of the academy in the foundation, in the founding of the US nation, which means in settler colonialism, in colonialism, in racism. There's no way around that. And there's, Craig Stephen Wilder's book comes immediately to mind, Ebony and Ivy. But you can also look at Sandy Grand's work. You can look at all kinds of histories that actually document them, right? There is no such thing as an unimplicated, non-complicit way of inhabiting an institution like the academy. I think that diagnosis, I'm just not sure, gets us anywhere politically, which is to say that I don't think complicity operates very well as a mobilizing force for radical politics. What I think it can do is to make us, again, disidentify from the aims of the institution, right? So that the lures, what's held out to us as the kind of, brass ring, right, of the academy is not the driving thing, right? But that we actually can inhabit normative institutions in different ways. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I mean, absolutely, I think there's, huge differences, certainly between the people who initiated and inaugurated Asian American studies in the 1960s and 70s in primarily West Coast universities, and people who are us, essentially, right? People, organizing and participating on this panel. But the responsibility that we have is going to be differentially distributed depending on the communities that we are responsible to, right? So, partly I get a little confused because I don't actually fold everything about my life into the world of the academy, right? So there are activities and things that I do that have really nothing to do, or I try actually to keep them away from the life that I lead inside of academic institutions. I want that to be okay. And so, in the ways in which I think about how I am accountable to certain kinds of communities, or the sorts of work that I do along those lines, I don't necessarily want it to be all legible to the institution, right? That there are some ways that the informality, I think, can be a way of working that is a sharing of resources and a sharing and a kind of redistribution of resources that we get from being inside of the institution without naming it as such. Because once you name it as such, it kind of becomes part of the economy of the institution. And there's something nice about not doing that. So that's one thing. The other thing, as I said, I guess in terms of kind of the academic publishing industry, so like colonialism, all of that, yeah, like those are the conditions, the kind of contradictions, the impossible, the fraught, the really fracturing conditions that we are inhabiting. And I don't think that we can, I don't have an easy resolve to that, right? But I do think that the project is, there's a kind of demand there, right? An urgent demand that we actually are constantly looking up. I don't know how else to put it. Like, we're always constantly looking up to see what other questions we should be asking, what other people are asking, right? And so that there isn't a kind of complacency in thinking if we can only produce the appropriate knowledge, then the world is better, right? But rather really understanding that there is a configuration of power and knowledge that has to be operated together. And, that's what I would say, right now, I don't know how much longer we have in terms of these kinds of university formations, right? But right now, with the time that we do have, the question in the project is always, how are we going to leverage that time and space, right? And in a place like CUNY, the City University of New York, which is where I work, the impetus is always to remember that our job is to hold open space for people and ideas that couldn't otherwise have the room to develop or to sink into or to be elaborated, right? And that feels to me still like a worthwhile project. I don't know that it will continue to, right? There are all kinds of foreclosures that I know we're all facing in different university settings. But, I can't quite let go of what we can do until people make me, I guess. So that's it.
So we have lots of questions, but I think we're just going to go through 3 more questions. So the first one is from Anju. The question is, do you think Asian Americans react and experience racism differently than Asian American first generation immigrants?
It's such a contingent question. So let me answer it this way. I think that depending on when and how one enters this place and in what context, so whether it's a community formation, whether it's an individual person coming as a student, whether, coming in through familial ties, whatnot, right? The experience of place is going to be radically different. Like the place itself, I think, is radically different. So I can't imagine that the experience of racism isn't different, right? but I can't begin to explain in what way. Yeah. So, so having said that, I also think, one of the things about, it's not even transpacific, it's just like actually attuning to anywhere else, right, on the planet. You kind of figure out, like, people in, I don't know, I spent some time in Korea last year, people in Korea they're not identifying themselves as Asian, right? They're identifying themselves as South Korean or Korean or whatever, particularity, yeah. So, it may, there's a lot of variation, I think, on how people coming from various places on the planet enter a space where there is this kind of, really pre-existing racial discourse and find themselves situated. So, certainly that experience is going to be legible, but also translated in different ways for different people coming in. And that's something that we, it's helpful to be attuned to as scholars and as teachers and students of migration and Asian American subjectivity, because it is, again, it goes back to disaggregating that term, right? To not allowing it to stand as this kind of a lumpen essentialist thing.
And this question is from Lauren Joe. She writes, through Asian American activism history, I find that oftentimes attention toward anti-Asian hate and mobilization occurs or garners attention in the aftermath of BLM or Black Power movements. Do you think that this dilutes the validity and effectiveness of Asian American movements, or does it actually enhance it?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I mean, if the question is because there has been a robust proliferation of attention to BLM, right, to anti-Blackness and particularly to the BLM movement, it is therefore the context in which we understand anti-Asian racism in the contemporary moment, for sure. I think that there's no question about that. You can see it in some of the signage even, right? Asian Lives Matter, certainly appearing. I don't think it's a question of dilution. I think it's a question of attending to, well, a couple of things. One is, I think, there is a way that I'm not sure the extent to which some of what we see in the public sphere, the mass rallies, how much they are going to be reshaped and kind of, form into sustaining movements, so much as being mobilizations. And I don't, mobilizations do their own work, right? But movement, I think, is something different. I think it has a different kind of apparatus and infrastructure and, networking sort of feel or sensory experience of it. I think that there has been an enormous amount of solidarity, mutuality, kind of camaraderie, right, across movements that are addressing various forms of violence against certainly racialized violence, but also gendered sexualized violence as well. And that is, to my mind, it's one of the effects of the discourse of intersectionality that has become more culturally and kind of culturally popularized, I guess. Not always to great effect, I think, but generally speaking. So I wouldn't even ask the question in terms of dilution, but rather reframe that so that there's a way that we can always be looking for how to build on each other's energies, right? On the energies of the movements, right? And whatever movement you are committed to, right? And a kind of a part of. And that's what it means, to my mind, to be in community, right? To be in collaboration. There's a definition of colleague that I particularly like, which is, colleagues are people who help you hold up your vision of the world, right? And they'll do the kind of grunt work, the really unglamorous stuff, you know. That's my sense of what it means to be part of a movement, and what it means to be part of, you know, to think BLM together with Stop Asian Hate, right? Together with the, you know, no DAPL, right? The North Dakota pipeline, access to pipeline. I mean, I think all of that together, it has to be done together, right? There is no way to delink it, and you know, it has been. It's a trick of nations. It's a trick of empire to make us believe that these are issues that are separable from each other. And our job is to restore the linkages, right? To restore understanding what they are, so that we don't have to think in terms of dilution, or so that we don't have to think in terms of, you know, antagonisms between, right? But actually can really focus in on the possibilities of working in mutuality.
I do think that this question is also very much asking about the political invisibility of Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in the United States. And, you know, perhaps the question is also, do you think that movements such as Stop Asian Hate and other movements would have garnered as much attention as they had they not occurred after the summer of the massive BLM protests?
Right. You know, I don't. I mean, and I don't because, and I think that, but I think that the BLM protests wouldn't have happened without the massive movements that we saw in the 1960s or the 1950s, or, you know, so that there are prehistories, right? And you know, the work that BLM has done to shift the cultural discourse, right, is really phenomenal. And so I'm not suggesting that there isn't anything distinctive about it, but that there is actually a genealogy out of which it emerges. And it's a fantastic way of thinking how knowledge is conveyed on the street, right? How knowledge is conveyed through the street, as it were. As to, you know, yeah, I suppose there is a kind of political invisibility. I don't know, you know, that question of invisibility, it really, like, that's another thing that makes my ears itch, you know, because I think there's so many ways that Asian Americans are actually, and Asianness is really visible, right? I mean, it is so often, well, I feel like we are often called upon to be the person of color who legitimates the otherwise white committee, institution, organization, blah, 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 whatever. So in that respect, you know, I don't ever see us as not being made to be visible as POCs. Whether it's a question, you know, if there's a question about, and then there's also like the other kind of political legibility that Asian Americans have is really the majoritarian one, right? It's like the, you know, the very small select group of people who are suing Harvard, right? For discrimination, or the very small select group of people who, you know, really are majoritarian inclined, really are really like, they want to be the next Jeff Bezos or whoever, you know, the next person is, right? And I guess that we, you know, and this is something that Laura Kang has written, but also, you know, kind of really encouraged me to think about, which is we have to become accountable for that person too, right? As an Asian Americanist, we can't say they're just bad subjects, and so they're not my people, I'm not going to deal with it. But really, again, to ask that question of like, how is that formation being realized, right? What are the conditions that are emerging there? I think there is something, you know, in the outpouring of, there's just been a lot of people who, in the aftermath of Atlanta, but also the kinds of, you know, there's so many videos and whatever replays of person after person of Asian descent getting beaten up on the streets, right? And the most moving ones, of course, are always the elderly for me, the most vulnerable people on the street. So there was a huge outpouring after that of a lot of like, yeah, me too, I faced that. Yeah, I've had, you know, harassment. Oh, thank God people are finally recognizing that. And while there is a kind of affirmation or catharsis that I understand what's happening, I think that there is also something that's really dangerous about that. I think that there's really something that really, it's a moment when I thought, oh, but how come we weren't saying that when we were watching the police brutality over and over again, and the murders of Black people at those hands? Or how come we aren't saying that when we're seeing the detention centers at the borders, right, with all of those children there? That what is it that is being replayed in terms of a kind of racial essentialism, right? That has so become a part of my bodily fabric, right? That I'm only moved in this instance. And, you know, again, I'm not at all castigating any individual's responses. I just really want to understand what culturally, what historically, what political, economically we've put into place that makes that happen, because it's just, it doesn't feel right. Right? Like in this kind of deep epistemic way, there's something wrong if we are being told to value and care for people only based on certain kinds of categories.
I'm going to now pose the very last question, which very much has to do with categories, from Chris Park. He writes, how relevant is the AAPI label when experiences of different Asian ethnicities are often so different? And how do we resolve the conflict of interests, experiences, demands, and so forth between specific Asian ethnicities and a more pan-Asian identity?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for the question. I don't think that we should be trying to resolve those kinds of differences. I think that there is no category that is complete, exhaustive, or accurate, right? So the problem is not only the PI that's part of the AAPI, but also just, you know, any kind of rubric. So Asian itself, or, you know, any of those things. They are very much administrative categories, right? That are useful as a way of leveraging and tapping into resources. They are not, you know, one of the problems I think that we've seen in academic institutions is that sometimes they take the lead as if they are something kind of an originary ground rather than a fiction. A really important, useful, you know, kind of materializing, it's got lots of material force fiction, but something that is finally in the end without a stable definition. And that's okay. I mean, you know, I don't, right now, given the conditions that we exist in, I'm happy to leverage what I can, right? I'm using that rubric, however flawed or faulty it might be. But I'm also, I want us also to be prepared to jettison it, right? That the point is not to try to claim it. And the point is not to try to say, but, you know, if we can only make it mean this, then everything will be all right. Right? In my view, it's really most useful as a category of analysis, as an intellectual tool or method, more so than it is in any other, you know, kind of capacity. But I also recognize that it has a lot of affective, you know, it does have an affective appeal, and it does organize communities. And in that way, I never want to, you know, dismiss that and say that that's not important. I think there are so many on the ground organizations that are actually operating to provide the goods and services that the state refuses to do, right? And those are often organized around categories of identity, and, you know, more power to them, right? I mean, more resources to them in some way. But in terms of discourse and language, I just think that we have to kind of keep using more words to remind ourselves and each other that the idea of Asia and the idea of the Asian American and the API is actually a fiction, right? And that, you know, we have lots of words, we should use them all.
Well, we have quite a few more questions in the Q&A, and I apologize that we can't get to all of them, but thank you so much for your questions, and thank you so much to you, Kandice Chuh, for this really insightful and thought-provoking discussion. I think, in fact, one of the remaining questions was, do you have any more webinars planned? Because I think I think that'd be
Thank
wonderful,
you.
but
You guys have been terrific. And thank you so much for the really thought-provoking questions and the engagement with all of this. You know, it's a collective project and an ongoing one, and we just have to keep pushing at it together. So I appreciate your attendance and attention very much.
So in conclusion, I mean, first, I also want to thank Kandice. I can't believe you got through all of that in one piece, because that was demanding. I mean, to answer all these just really complex and I think very heartfelt questions. Something that we here at Hopkins have felt, you know, since especially, I mean, really during all of COVID, but especially since the Atlanta shootings, is that our students are very deeply invested in trying to understand what it is that's going on around them. And your comments reminded me of how sometimes, you know, as in intellectually engaging with some of these issues and their complexities, oftentimes students have said, but I feel certain ways about it. You know, like I know in my head I'm supposed to honor and you know, be in solidarity with other groups, but you know, like I feel this affective identification with, say, you know, people that they consider fellow Asians and whatnot. And so we've really had to you know, we've started to work through, and you know, as you were saying, like in certain moments it's best not to take things personally, and yet we've been socialized to take them personally. And so you know, I find that, I mean, your thoughts today, especially about, I mean, you're in the title of your talk, you say the promise of hate, but really it's the lack of a promise, or rather that there is a kind of a lore that is created and a promise that is promised, but will probably never come to fruition. Thank you so much for helping to launch our initiative. I really don't think we could have asked for a more perfect talk and person and conversation. So thank you. And thank you, of course, to those of you who attended in the audience. I know we can't see one another in this format, but we know you're there. You helped this event, you know, be a success. We do have other upcoming events this fall, and there is a link now in the chat where you can go to our Eventbrite page and see that the next event to follow is next Thursday, November 4th, and it's a roundtable organized by the Racism, Immigration, Citizenship Program at Johns Hopkins, and it's roundtable on Black Asian solidarities, confronting anti-Black and anti-Asian racism, which really resonates with some of the questions that were raised today. So hopefully some of you can attend that. And then after that, we have Professor Eileen Chow, who was at the webinar today, presenting to us her talk on violence, grief, and Asian American kin making. So there's lots to come. Thank you again, Dr. Chuh, for launching our initiative and helping to really, I mean, just bring incredible intellectual energy and generosity to our project here.